5 minutes after 10 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. You ever become familiar with a story and there are some characters in the story that you wondered, I wonder what happened to that character? The author never really developed one or two of the characters. Well, that's exactly what happened in Alice in Wonderland. There were a couple of characters and they have now been developed. Gregory Maguire is on the phone to talk to us about this. He is a lecturer on art, literature, and culture. He's the founder of Children's Literature New England, which is a nonprofit educational charity focusing on the significance of literature in the lives of children. I can't agree more with what that implies. He writes and performs original work for National Public Radio and Public Radio International. He's a New York Times bestselling author. His book Wicked is the basis for the Tony Award-winning Broadway musical Wicked. So now that you've been impressed with credentials, let me tell you his new book is called After Alice. It is the story of Alice's sister Lydia and Alice's friend Ada after Alice disappears into Wonderland. Good morning, Gregory. This is fascinating. How are you doing?
Good morning, Larry. I am doing just great, I have to say. It's nice to talk with you.
You too. Where are you calling from?
I'm in Concord, Massachusetts.
So how did this happen for you? Were you wondering, like the rest of us, who's Lydia? How come we don't know more about her?
Oh, absolutely. I always like to look at the side characters, as you point out. And in Alice in Wonderland, Lydia, the older sister, I think has no more than 3 sentences in the whole book. But let's face it, she's required to be babysitting her sister, and she loses her. So whatever else happens to Alice that day, boy, Lydia is in a heap of trouble because she's lost track of the very person she's supposed to be taking care of.
Oh, wow. So did this happen, like, were you talking to friends about this, or were you driving the car when you started wondering about this and developed it into a book?
Well, I think it was more the case that I was aware that Alice in Wonderland was coming up for 150th anniversary, and I went back to read it just out of honor, really, because it's a great book and important book in the history of fantasy written for children, which is my métier. And I thought, gee, there's a lot of things about this story that Lewis Carroll doesn't concentrate on, and some of them take place in Oxford. I mean, let's face it, in the mid-19th century Oxford, a lot was going on. Darwin was having his battles about the new theory of evolution. Everybody was trembling about what that was going to mean about faith and about systems of understanding. And children, who are the weakest among us, were going to have to endure those earthquake shocks of recalibrations as well. So all of that kind of led me back to Wonderland and back down the rabbit hole.
That's kind of a rabbit hole in and of itself, isn't it? That whole period of time.
And you can see where Lewis Carroll got a lot of his ideas. I mean, a lot of what he talks about in terms of things transforming from one to another, a pig into a baby and back into a pig. Well, that sure sounds like evolutionary theory, doesn't it?
It does.
You know what? Yeah, it sure does. Yeah, he must have been inspired by that. Did you feel like you had to be true in any way to the characters, even though there was really nothing to be true to, or did you just let your creative juices dictate everything?
Well, I did feel I had to be true to the characters because I'm not a script writer for Saturday Night Live or the old Carol Burnett show. I'm not a parodist. I don't try to make fun of the originals. What I really try to do is honor them and to write in their own spirit, but also to write with a 21st century idea about what literature does and about what the embedded meanings, if you will, might have been in the original works that we can now see. After all, Lewis Carroll was a genius, but the one thing he couldn't see is what the world was going to be like 150 years after he wrote his great book. And that's maybe the only thing I can provide. So I provide it happily, although I'm no genius. I'm just a nice kind of clunkhead.
And with your field of expertise, you bring art and culture all together in your work of literature, and that really is important to express that to the children.
Well, it's funny. I think children are the most wonderful ambulatory sponges we have on this planet because they walk around soaking everything up. It's really important to give them nutrition, and to, not just to amuse them, not just to keep them from playing in the road or from getting hooked onto, video porn. It's important to keep their minds and the apparatuses of their receptors fully functioning, because let's face it, they're going to have to sort out the messes they inherit, just as we have tried to sort out the messes that we have inherited.
I have a question for you about writing. We had this discussion the other day that if you gave 100 people a typewriter and told them all to write the same story, none of the stories would be the same. If you gave 100 people brushes and paints and canvases, the same thing would happen. It would all be it would be 100 different paintings. There was an interview I heard once with Paul McCartney, and he was talking about an album he made of standards, and he wrote some of the songs, even though they weren't all written by him. But in order to become more familiar with the writing style of the Great American Songbook, I guess from the 40s and 30s, he immersed himself in it. He listened to it a lot, so that when he would write, it would sort of have influenced his writing style, because he didn't really have that style beforehand. And so I said all that just to ask you this. Did you do the same thing? I mean, did you immerse yourself into the writing of that period, especially the Alice in Wonderland story, to try to mimic the style?
Well, I'll tell you, Larry, it's kind of shocking. I certainly did a lot of research. I went to Oxford several times, and I read books about Darwin, particularly because I knew Darwin would be a kind of looming presence in my novel. But the one thing I did not do was go back and reread Lewis Carroll himself. But I have read Lewis Carroll so often in my life. I've read Alice in Wonderland maybe a dozen times in 60 years, that when it came time for me to write, it was almost as if I was channeling his word-conscious, literate and droll manner, in the same way that Paul McCartney may not have said, I'm not imitating a particular line of melody from George M. Cohen or from, Rodgers and Hart, but what I am is subconsciously now emulating or imitating something that I have learned subconsciously. And so that's what happened. And frankly, it happened more adroitly and more easily than I could have imagined, and I wasn't even really expecting it to happen. But if you pick up after Alice and you read a few of the sections in Wonderland where some of the old-fashioned famous characters come in, like the Mad Hatter or the Cheshire Cat or the Queen of Hearts, my gosh, to my ear, they really sound like they just stepped directly out of the pages of Lewis Carroll's book into my own book.
Wow.
And you've also brought in a new perspective on the story with introducing Ada, even though she was in Lewis Carroll's original book, but briefly.
Yeah. One sentence in Lewis Carroll's original book, and in my book, she is the entire central character. She goes down the rabbit hole after Alice, which is why the book is called that, in order to rescue Alice from a wonderland that is far more dangerous and risky than innocent Alice really has the capacity to understand. But I also put in another child. There is a boy named Siam, who is an American escaped slave from the American Civil War era, who has been taken to England by an abolitionist in order to avoid having him be re-kidnapped back into slavery. And he, too, falls down Wonderland. So for the first time in 150 years, Wonderland has been integrated. It's now multiracial.
Well, good for you. Gregory, what a fascinating conversation. I know you've got other interviews to do. I have a copy of After Alice. Call me if you want it. The rest of us have to go buy it. Gregory Maguire is who you will look up. And you have a website, gregorymaguire.com?
That's right. It's Maguire.
Okay. Thank you for being on the air with us. I know you're busy. Thank you so much for taking time, and thank you for adding to the story. I think everybody who is a Alice in Wonderland fan is going to love this.
Thank you, Larry. Have a great day.
Thank you, Gregory. You too. We'll be right back.
The weather is brought to you by myfwc.com. Safe boating is no accident. Sunshine mixing with clouds on this Wednesday. It'll be hot. There can be an afternoon thunderstorm in the area, the high 94 to 98. And ending up mainly clear Wednesday night, lows in the mid to upper 70s. Thursday,